Dad, please do not come to Jason's wedding. It is better if you stay home. My father's voice cut through the stillness of the living room, sharp and metallic. I stayed frozen on the staircase, my hand resting on the cool wood of the banister. I could feel the pulse thumping in my throat, a steady, rhythmic reminder that I was witnessing something I could never unsee. My father, Richard, stood near the fireplace. He wasn't looking at the man he was speaking to. Instead, he was adjusting the cuff of his shirt, a focused, clinical movement that made the cruelty of his statement feel even more calculated. Grandpa Henry was 78 years old. He was sitting in that old armchair of his, the one with the sagging springs and the scent of peppermint and old books. He looked up at my father, and for a second, I saw his hands tremble. He tried to clasp them together in his lap to hide the shake, but it was no use. "But it is my grandson's wedding," Grandpa said. His voice was so thin it barely reached the bottom of the stairs. It was a plea, not an argument. "Exactly," my mother interjected. Patricia stepped into the light of the floor lamp, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood. She didn't have my father's calculated coldness. Hers was a sharp, jagged edge. "And we do not want you embarrassing us in front of Emily's family. The Thompsons are people of standing, Henry. Do you understand what is at stake here?" I watched from the shadows of the landing. My chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped a wire around my ribs and was slowly pulling it taut. I thought about stepping down. I thought about screaming. But my feet wouldn't move. I was 29 years old, a woman who made her living as a freelance writer, someone who was supposed to be good with words. Yet, in that moment, I was a ghost in my own home. "I am your father," Grandpa Henry said. I could see the moisture in his eyes now, reflecting the amber glow of the living room lamps. "And I am trying to build a legacy for my children," my father roared. The sudden volume made me jump. He finally looked at his father, but there was no love in his eyes. Only resentment. "I cannot have you making us look bad in front of them. You will stay home." End of discussion. That was the moment the Mitchell family as I knew it began to dissolve. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I am 29, and I live in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, where the smell of damp pine and roasted coffee usually feels like home. But that night, in my parents' sprawling house in the West Hills, nothing felt familiar. I have spent my life observing people, writing their stories, trying to find the truth beneath the surface. I thought I knew my family. I thought I knew the man my father was. I was wrong. They thought I was just the quiet daughter, the one who didn't care about real estate contracts or social standing. They thought Grandpa Henry was just a retired electronics technician who had outlived his usefulness. They were so focused on the Thompsons, the powerful attorneys, the university professors, the people with the right last names, that they forgot who had actually built the floor they were standing on. They saw Grandpa as a burden, an embarrassment in a ratty suit. I saw him as the man who used to take me to the park and tell me stories about building airplanes at Boeing. I saw the man who had sacrificed his own security to save my father from bankruptcy 15 years ago. They thought this was the end of the conversation. They thought they had successfully tucked a piece of their history away in a dark corner so it wouldn't ruin the wedding photos. But they didn't realize that when you push someone too far, you lose the right to dictate where they go next. They had no idea that I was already moving pieces of my own. They didn't know that Grandpa Henry and I had been talking. Before I go any further with what happened next, I have to ask you something. I really need to know. Have you ever been in a position where you felt like you had to choose between your family's expectations and what was actually right? Have you ever had to stand up for someone when everyone else was telling you to just keep the peace? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It's important to me to know who is listening to this. And if you believe that family is about more than just a name on an invitation, hit the subscribe button. This story gets much more complicated, and I want to make sure you hear the part where my parents finally got exactly what they asked for. Let me take you back to how this all started. It wasn't just that one night on the stairs. It was a slow burn. The wedding was 3 weeks away. My brother Jason, who is 26 and works in marketing, was about to marry Emily Thompson. To my parents, this wasn't just a wedding. It was a merger. It was their ticket into a world they had been clawing at for decades. Portland is a city that prides itself on being casual, but in certain circles, the old rules still apply. Emily's father was a senior partner at the city's most prestigious law firm. Her mother was a professor at Portland State. They were the kind of people who had charity galas on their calendars 6 months in advance. My father, with his medium-sized real estate company, desperately wanted to be one of them. He wanted the contracts. He wanted the prestige. And he was willing to trade his own father to get it. I remember the rain that week. It was a relentless, gray drizzle that seemed to soak into everything. I had driven over to my parents' house to help with some of the logistics, though mostly I was there to check on Grandpa. He had moved in with them a few years prior, after his health had taken a small dip. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, but it had stretched on. I walked into the kitchen and found my mother staring at a seating chart spread across the granite island. She was holding a red pen like a surgeon's scalpel. We can't have him at the main table, Sarah, she said without looking up. She circled a spot near the back of the room, close to the service entrance. Who? I asked, though I already knew, your grandfather. He'll get confused. He'll tell those long stories about the 1970s and the Thompsons will just stare at him. It's better if we put him with the distant cousins from out of town. They're used to him. Grandpa isn't a prop, Mom, I said. I could feel the heat rising in my face. He's the patriarch of this family. Don't be dramatic, she snapped. This is about the guest experience. Jason needs this to be perfect. Emily's parents are judging everything. I looked at the chart. Grandpa's name was tucked away in a corner, far from the lights, far from the toasts, far from the son he had raised alone. I thought about the $15,000 he had given my father 15 years ago. I thought about the house he had mortgaged to make sure my father didn't lose his business. My father hadn't mentioned that to the Thompsons. I was sure. As I stood there in the kitchen, listening to the rain and the scratch of my mother's pen, I realized that my family was performing a play. They were actors on a stage, trying to convince the world they were something they weren't. And Grandpa Henry was the only one who remembered the lines they had forgotten. I went upstairs to see him. His room was at the end of the hall, tucked away like an afterthought. When I knocked, he was sitting by the window, watching the clouds move over the West Hills. Hey, Grandpa, I said softly. Hello, sweetheart. He didn't turn around. He just kept staring at the gray sky. Do you think it will rain on the wedding day? I don't know, I said. I hope not, he whispered. I want everything to be bright for Jason. He deserves a bright day. My heart broke then. Not a clean break, but a slow, jagged tear. He was sitting there worrying about the weather for a grandson who was currently arguing about whether he was too ratty to sit at the head table. That was the beginning. The 3 weeks that followed were a masterclass in subtle cruelty. Invitations that were never sent. Conversations that stopped when he entered the room. The slow, methodical erasure of a man's presence from his own family. They thought they were being clever. They thought they were being socially aware. But they forgot one thing. I'm a writer. I notice the things people try to hide. And Grandpa Henry? He might have been 78, but he wasn't blind. He saw every look. He heard every whisper. And he was making plans of his own. Plans that would change the Mitchell legacy forever. The silence in the house during those 3 weeks was different than the usual quiet of the West Hills. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of a home at rest. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, the kind that gathers in the corners of a room when too many things are being left unsaid. I spent more time there than I usually did, ostensibly to help with the floral arrangements and the final guest list, but really, I was a sentry. I was watching my father's jaw tighten every time Grandpa Henry's footsteps creaked in the hallway above us. I was watching my mother's eyes dart toward the door whenever the doorbell rang, terrified it might be a neighbor seeing the wrong Mitchell. I watched my mother handle the invitation for the Thompson family as if it were a holy relic. She spent 4 hours one afternoon verifying the calligraphy on the inner envelopes. She used a magnifying glass to ensure there were no ink splatters. To her, those envelopes were proof of her assent. They were white, heavy stock paper that smelled of expensive vanilla and ambition. My name was on one. Jason's was on another. Grandpa Henry's name didn't exist in that stack. He was a ghost before he was even dead. My mother looked up at me, her face pale under the kitchen's recessed lighting. Sarah, make sure your dress is tailored properly. We can't have you looking like you just rolled out of a coffee shop. Emily's bridesmaids are all wearing custom silk. I'll be fine, Mom, I said. I kept my voice flat. I was thinking about the time I was 12 and my father had sold Grandpa's vintage ham radio equipment at a garage sale while Grandpa was in the hospital for a minor procedure. He told Grandpa it had been lost in a basement flood. I remembered seeing the look on Grandpa's face when he realized his favorite hobby, the one that connected him to people all over the world, was just gone. He didn't scream. He didn't even cry. He just sat in his chair and stared at the empty workbench in the garage. My father didn't care about the radio. He just wanted the space for his new golf clubs. That was the first time I realized that in this house, things were only valuable if they served my father's image. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight in my stomach. It was a cold, hard stone that had been sitting there for 17 years. The week before the wedding, the Thompsons came over for a formal dinner. It was the final meeting of the minds, as my father called it. He had spent thousands on catering, hiring a private chef who moved through our kitchen with the efficiency of a clockwork toy. The air smelled of seared scallops and reduction sauces. My father wore his best navy suit, the one that made him look like the successful developer he so desperately wanted the Thompsons to believe he was. "Where is Henry?" Edward Thompson asked halfway through the first course. Edward was a man who spoke in measured, resonant tones, the kind of voice that commanded a courtroom. "I thought he was staying with you. My father didn't skip a beat. He took a sip of a very expensive Cabernet, swirling it in the glass. "Oh, Dad's not feeling quite up to social gatherings lately. His memory, you know. We thought it best he rest upstairs. It's a bit much for him, all the excitement." I looked at my father. He lied with such effortless grace. It was terrifying. He didn't even blink. He just smiled that practiced, white-toothed smile and pivoted the conversation to the new urban development project in the Pearl District. He was selling a version of our family that had no room for the man who had actually built it. Grandpa wasn't resting. He was sitting in his room with a tray of cold sandwiches the chef had prepared as an afterthought. I knew this because I had slipped away between the second and third course. I found him sitting by his window again. The light from the street lamp outside cast long, skeletal shadows across his floor. "Are they having a good time?" he asked. He didn't look at the sandwiches. "They're talking about real estate, Grandpa," I said. I sat on the edge of his bed. I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it made my hands shake. I gripped the edge of the mattress until my knuckles turned white. "Real estate," he whispered. He gave a small, sad chuckle. "Your father always did love the dirt more than the house." I leaned in closer. "Grandpa, I have an idea. I don't want you to stay here on the wedding day. I don't want you sitting in this room while they pretend you don't exist." He finally looked at me. His eyes were clear, sharper than I had seen them in weeks. "What are you thinking, Sarah? I have a friend who owns a car service," I said. It was a lie, but a necessary one. I actually intended to use a significant portion of my savings. "I want you to go somewhere. Somewhere where people will actually appreciate you. And I want you to do it in style." He looked at me for a long time. The sounds of laughter drifted up from the dining room below, my mother's sharp, trilling laugh and Edward Thompson's deep baritone. It sounded like a performance. It sounded like a lie. "I don't want to cause trouble," Henry said. "You aren't the one causing trouble," I told him. I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "They are. They've decided that you're a liability. But they forgot that you're the one who holds all the cards." I was thinking about the box. The small, metal lockbox Grandpa kept under his bed. I knew what was in it. Not because he had told me, but because I had seen him looking through it late at night when he thought everyone was asleep. It wasn't jewelry or cash. It was paper, documents, old contracts. The kind of things my father had spent years trying to bury. I watched Grandpa's face. For the first time in months, I saw a spark of something other than resignation. It was a flicker of the man who used to build airplanes. The man who understood how things worked. The man who knew that if you remove the foundation, the whole house comes down. He nodded slowly. All right, Sarah. What do? We spent the next hour talking in whispers. I told him about the car I would hire. I told him about the suit I had hidden in my own apartment, a bespoke charcoal wool that I had bought with my last 2 freelance checks. My parents thought they were the only ones who could play the prestige game. They were wrong. I had been observing them for 29 years. I knew their weaknesses better than they knew their own strengths. As I walked back down to the dinner party, I felt a strange sense of calm. The tightness in my chest had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. I walked back into the dining room just as my father was finishing a story about his self-made success. Everything okay, Sarah? He asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Fine, Dad, I said. I sat down and picked up my fork. Just checking on Grandpa. He's sound asleep. My mother beamed at me. Good. He needs his rest. It's going to be a big day for all of us. I looked at her. I looked at the Thompsons. I looked at the expensive wine and the polished silver and the perfect, curated life my parents had constructed. Yes, I said. It certainly is. The week of the wedding arrived with a sudden, violent shift in the weather. The gray drizzle turned into a heavy, drenching downpour that flooded the gutters and turned the West Hills into a slick, emerald maze. My mother was in a state of near collapse, terrified the outdoor portion of the reception would be ruined. She spent hours on the phone with the event planners, her voice rising in pitch until it sounded like a frantic bird. I stayed out of her way. I had my own preparations to manage. I picked up the suit from the tailor. I confirmed the driver. I made sure Grandpa had everything he needed. We were like 2 spies operating in enemy territory. We communicated in nods and brief, whispered sentences in the hallway. They didn't notice. They were too busy with the seating charts and the flowers and the Thompsons. They were so focused on the image of the wedding that they had completely lost sight of the people in it. Jason was a nervous wreck, Emily was demanding, and my parents were the directors of a play that was quickly spiraling out of control. I remember standing in my apartment the night before the wedding. I looked at the suit hanging on the back of my door. I looked at the notebook where I had written down the timeline for the next day. I felt a fleeting moment of hesitation. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to help Grandpa Henry execute a plan that would humiliate my parents in front of the very people they were trying to impress? Then I thought about the garage sale. I thought about the ham radio equipment. I thought about Grandpa sitting in his dark room with a tray of cold sandwiches while his son lied about his health to a room full of strangers. The hesitation vanished. I'm curious. If you were in my shoes, would you have done the same? Would you have stayed quiet and let the wedding go on as planned, or would you have helped the person who had been sidelined? Let me know in the comments. I really want to know what you think about loyalty. That night, I didn't sleep much. I listened to the rain against my window and thought about the legacy my father was so obsessed with. He thought a legacy was a name on a building or a seat at the right table. He didn't realize that a legacy is actually the way you treat the people who loved you when you had nothing. The morning of the wedding was gray and cold. I drove to my parents' house early. The driveway was already clogged with delivery vans and florist trucks. The house was a hive of frantic activity. My mother was wearing a silk robe and shouting at a caterer about the temperature of the champagne. My father was in his study, likely practicing his speech. I slipped upstairs. Grandpa's door was closed. I knocked softly and went in. He was already dressed in his old robe, but he was standing by the bed, looking at the garment bag I had brought over the night before. Is it time? He asked. It's time, I said. I helped him get ready. The charcoal suit fit him perfectly. It made him look dignified, older and far more powerful than the man in the sagging armchair. I adjusted his tie, a deep burgundy silk. "You look like a king, Grandpa," I whispered. He looked at himself in the mirror. He stood a little taller. He squared his shoulders. "I don't want to be a king, Sarah. I just want to be a father. And a grandfather." I took his hand. It was steady. My own heart was racing, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but his hand was like a rock. We walked down the back stairs, avoiding the main hallway where my mother was currently berating a bridesmaid. We slipped out the side door and into the waiting black car. The driver, a professional I had vetted personally, opened the door. Grandpa slid inside. I leaned in and kissed his cheek. "I'll see you there," I said. He nodded. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. I know exactly what I'm doing." I watched the car disappear down the rain-slicked driveway. I stood there for a moment, the cold rain soaking into my hair, and I realized that there was no going back. The fuse was lit. The play was about to change. I walked back into the house. My mother saw me in the hallway. "Sarah, where have you been? You need to get your hair done. And where's your grandfather?" "I told the nurse to make sure he stayed in his room today." "He's resting, Mom," I said. I looked her straight in the eye and didn't blink. "He's exactly where he needs to be." She huffed and turned away, satisfied with the lie. She was so convinced of her own control that she couldn't imagine a world where she didn't have it. She didn't realize that the man she had tried to erase was currently driving toward the one place she had forbidden him to go. I went to my room to get ready. My hands were finally still. The adrenaline had transitioned into a cold, hard focus. I put on my dress, a simple, elegant black. I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look like a writer anymore. I looked like a witness. The wedding was at a historic estate in the hills, a place of stone arches and sprawling gardens that were currently being shielded by massive white tents. It was the height of Portland luxury. As I pulled up in my own car, I saw the valet lines, the flash of expensive jewelry, the sea of umbrellas. It was a beautiful, expensive, hollow spectacle. I found my place in the front row. My parents were already there, looking like the king and queen of a very small, very fragile kingdom. They were smiling and nodding, their eyes scanning the crowd for the right people. They didn't see me. They didn't see anything but the image they were projecting. Then the music started. The processional began. Jason stood at the altar, looking pale and terrified. Emily walked down the aisle, a vision in white lace and ambition. It was perfect. It was exactly what my mother had planned, until the doors at the back of the tent opened again. It wasn't a guest arriving late. It wasn't a staff member. It was a man in a charcoal suit, walking with a cane made of polished mahogany. He didn't walk like a man who was confused. He walked like a man who owned the ground he was stepping on. A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw my mother's face go from triumphant to ghostly white in a matter of seconds. I saw my father's hand grip the back of the chair in front of him so hard I thought the wood might snap. Grandpa Henry didn't look at them. He walked straight down the center aisle, his eyes fixed on his grandson. He didn't stop until he reached the front row. He didn't wait for an invitation. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took the empty seat next to my father. The silence that followed was louder than any music. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, like collapsing. My father leaned over, his voice a frantic, low hiss. "What are you doing here?" "I told you to stay home." Grandpa Henry didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes on Jason. "I'm here for my grandson's wedding, Richard. Just like you asked." He said it loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. I saw Edward Thompson's eyebrows shoot up. I saw Emily's mother lean in, her eyes wide with curiosity. The wedding went on, but the energy had shifted. The focus was no longer on the bride or the flowers or the merger. It was on the old man in the charcoal suit who had suddenly appeared like a ghost at the feast, but that was just the beginning. The ceremony was the easy part. The real work, the real revelation, was waiting for the reception. And I knew, as I watched my father's neck turn a dark, angry red, that the Mitchell legacy, was about to be rewritten in a way he could never have imagined. The air in the reception hall was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of a looming storm. After the ceremony, the guests filtered through the stone archways, their umbrellas dripping onto the polished marble floors. I watched my father. He was standing near the entrance, greeting people with a smile that looked like it had been carved out of stone. Every time a guest mentioned the elegant gentleman in the charcoal suit, his eyes would twitch a small, involuntary muscle spasm that betrayed the fury simmering just beneath his skin. I found a glass of champagne on a passing silver tray. The bubbles were sharp and cold against my tongue. My mother was across the room, huddled with the wedding coordinator. Her face was a mask of frantic composure. She kept glancing toward table 1, where Grandpa Henry was sitting. He wasn't at the back of the room near the service entrance. He had taken a seat right at the head of the family table. I remember when I was 16. Grandpa had spent 6 months restoring an old mahogany desk for my father's new office. It was a masterpiece of joinery and patience. On the day he delivered it, my father looked at it for 5 seconds before telling the movers to take it to the basement. He said it didn't fit the aesthetic of the modern firm. Grandpa just stood there, his hands still stained with wood oil, and nodded. He didn't say a word. I saw his heart break that day. It was a small death. I walked over to table 1. Grandpa was talking to Edward Thompson. Edward looked genuinely intrigued, leaning in as Grandpa described the structural integrity of the wing of AB 52. You know, Edward, my father said, appearing suddenly like a shadow. He placed a heavy hand on Grandpa's shoulder. It felt more like a restraint than an embrace. My father's knuckles were white. Dad has these wonderful old stories, but we really should let the younger folks take the floor. It's a busy day for him. Grandpa Henry looked up at his son. He didn't flinch. Actually, Richard, I feel quite energized. Edward was just asking about the patent I filed back in '84. You remember that one, don't you? The one that funded your first development project? The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. My father's face went through a kaleidoscope of emotions, shock, fear, and finally, a cold, hard anger. He hadn't expected Grandpa to speak about the money. He hadn't expected the foundation of his self-made myth to be poked in front of the city's most powerful attorney. I took a slow sip of my champagne. I watched my father's throat move as he swallowed. He was trapped. He couldn't make a scene without looking like a monster, and he couldn't let Grandpa keep talking without risking his reputation. Everything okay here? I asked. My voice was smooth, a perfect imitation of my mother's social grace. Everything is fine, Sarah, my father hissed. He leaned in closer to Grandpa, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. We will talk about this later. Stay in your seat. Do not move. He walked away, his stride stiff and jagged. I sat down next to Grandpa. His hand was resting on the white linen tablecloth. He looked at me and winked. It was the most rebellious thing I had ever seen him do. He is afraid, Sarah, Grandpa whispered. He should be, I said. I thought back to the documents in the lockbox. I thought about the way my father had systematically drained Grandpa's savings over the last decade, promising investments that never yielded returns. I thought about the way they had treated him like a piece of furniture that was losing its finish. The injustice wasn't just in the uninviting. It was in the years of quiet theft. The dinner service began. The room was a symphony of clinking silverware and polite laughter. I watched the Thompsons. They were sophisticated people. They valued tradition. They valued heritage. They were the very thing my father wanted to be, yet they were the ones most drawn to Grandpa's authenticity. It was a beautiful irony. I saw my brother, Jason, at the sweetheart table. He looked exhausted. He was caught between our mother's demands and Emily's vision of a perfect day. He looked at table 1, saw Grandpa, and, for a second, a look of genuine relief crossed his face. Then he looked at Dad, and the fear returned. It's a strange thing, watching a family act out a lie. I kept thinking about the senior support fund I had been researching. I had been working on a story about the hidden abuse of the elderly in wealthy families, not physical abuse, but the slow, psychological erasure of their autonomy. My father was a case study in it. He thought that because he provided a roof and a bed, he owned the man who lived under them. The tension in the room was a living thing. It curled around the centerpieces and hung in the rafters. Everyone could feel it. The ghost at the feast was the most interesting person in the room, and my parents were losing their grip on the narrative. As the main course was cleared, the wedding coordinator signaled for the speeches to begin. My father stood up. He adjusted his microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces, his gaze lingering for a split second on Grandpa Henry. He started with the usual platitudes. He spoke about family. He spoke about legacy. He spoke about the hard work that had brought them all to this moment. It was a polished speech, written by a professional, delivered with the practiced ease of a man who believed his own lies. But I noticed something. His hand was shaking. The paper in his grip was rustling, a tiny, frantic sound that the microphone picked up and amplified. He's nervous, I thought. He knows the foundation is cracked. And then, just as my father was about to toast the happy couple, Grandpa Henry stood up. He didn't have a microphone. He didn't have a prepared script. He just had his cane and 78 years of truth. The room went silent. You could hear the rain tapping against the tent roof. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the wedding party. "Richard," Grandpa said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a resonance that cut through the space. "I think you forgot a part of the story." My mother let out a small, strangled sound, half gasp and half sob. She looked like she was about to faint. My father's face was the color of ash. I felt a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made my vision blur for a second. This was it. This was the moment the play stopped and the real world began. I gripped the edge of my chair, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I'm curious. Have you ever seen someone finally stand up to a bully in the most public way possible? Have you ever witnessed the moment a long-held secret finally breaks the surface? It's a terrifying and beautiful thing to watch. Grandpa Henry took a slow, deliberate step toward the microphone. He looked at his son, and for the first time, there was no pity in his eyes. There was only the cold, hard weight of accountability. He was done being a ghost. I watched the Thompsons. Edward was leaning forward, his professional mask gone, replaced by a look of intense curiosity. Emily was frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth. My brother looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. My father tried to speak, but no sound came out. He was like a fish out of water, gasping for air that was no longer his to breathe. I'm going to tell you the rest of what happened that night, but first, I want you to think about what you would have done if you were in that room. Would you have tried to stop him? Or would you have sat back and watched the legacy burn? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I'm fascinated by how people view family loyalty in the face of betrayal. The rain grew louder, a drumming beat on the canvas above us. Grandpa Henry reached out and took the microphone from my father's frozen hand. He didn't even look at the man. He looked at the audience. I have a gift for the couple, he said. But it's not a gift you can wrap in paper. My father finally found his voice. Dad, please. This isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Grandpa said. He looked at Jason and Emily. I've spent a lot of years being quiet so your father could build his dream. I've spent a lot of years watching him use my name and my money to buy his way into rooms like this. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. The word money was like a grenade in a room full of people who pretended it didn't matter. But today, Grandpa continued, I realized that a legacy isn't something you buy. It's something you earn. And you don't earn it by hiding your father in a back room because you're ashamed of his shoes. He looked down at his charcoal suit. I think I look pretty good today, don't you? A few people in the back laughed. It was a nervous, breaking the tension kind of laugh. But at the head table, the air was freezing. Grandpa turned his gaze back to my father. Richard, I've decided to make a change. Those investments we talked about? The ones where my name is on the deeds? I've decided to liquidate my portion. My father's knees actually buckled. He had to grab the edge of the table to stay upright. That portion represented nearly 40% of his company's capital. It was the leverage he used for every new project, and I've decided, Grandpa said, his voice growing stronger with every word, that the proceeds will be used to start a foundation. A fund for seniors who have been sidelined by their own families. People who have been told they are an embarrassment. He looked at me then. He gave me a small, knowing smile. I felt a tear prick at the corner of my eye, but I didn't let it fall. I was too busy watching the Mitchell legacy dissolve in real time. My mother was now openly weeping into her silk napkin, but no one was looking at her. They were all looking at the man in the charcoal suit. They were seeing him for the first time in 20 years. And my father? He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trapdoor, and the rope had just been cut. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I've ever experienced. It was the sound of an era ending. It was the sound of the truth finally taking its place at the head of the table, but Grandpa wasn't finished. He had one more revelation, something that even I didn't know. Something that would make the Thompsons question everything they thought they knew about the man they were about to call family. I looked at the rain outside. It was a deluge now, washing away the carefully manicured gardens of the estate. It felt appropriate. The world was being cleansed. I sat back in my chair and took a final sip of my champagne. The play was over. The real story was just beginning. And I knew, with a cold and certain clarity, that my family would never be the same again. I thought about the ham radio. I thought about the mahogany desk. I thought about the cold sandwiches in the dark room. The debt was finally being paid, and the interest? The interest was going to be a masterpiece. I watched the microphone in my grandfather's hand. It was a vintage model, silver and heavy, and it looked perfectly at home in his weathered grip. My father, Richard, was a statue of salt beside him. He looked like he had been frozen in the middle of a scream he couldn't quite release. His face was a map of terror, the veins in his neck bulging against the collar of his expensive, custom-fitted shirt. Grandpa Henry adjusted his glasses with his free hand. He didn't look like the confused old man my mother had described to the Thompsons. He looked like the engineer he had always been, precise, methodical, and entirely aware of the stress points in the structure he was about to demolish. I've lived in that house for 7 years, Grandpa said, his voice echoing through the silent tent. And in those 7 years, I've learned a lot about what it means to be part of a legacy. I've learned that sometimes the people you think are building the future are actually just dismantling the past. He reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a simple red wax stamp. He held it out to Jason and Emily. "This is for you," he said. "It's the deed to the property in the gorge." A collective gasp went up. The property in the gorge was 40 acres of prime riverfront land that my father had been trying to get his hands on for a decade. He had told everyone, including the Thompsons, that it was already part of his development portfolio. But there's a condition, Grandpa continued. The land doesn't belong to Mitchell Developments. It belongs to a trust. A trust that I've placed Sarah in charge of. The silence was so heavy I could feel it pressing against my eardrums. I looked at my father. He looked like he was having a stroke. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. My mother, Patricia, had stopped crying. She was staring at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. I remembered a summer when I was 8 years old. Grandpa had built me a small wooden dollhouse in the garage. It had real shingles and tiny working window boxes. I loved it more than anything I owned. One Tuesday, while I was at camp, my father had the movers take it to the dump. He told me it was clutter and didn't fit the modern aesthetic of our new home. He didn't even ask. He just erased it because it wasn't perfect. I felt that same cold, hard stone in my stomach now. But this time, I wasn't the little girl losing her toy. I was the woman holding the keys to the kingdom. Edward Thompson stood up. His legal mind was clearly working at 1,000 miles an hour. Henry, are you saying the Gorge property was never part of Richard's firm? Richard tried to intervene. Edward, this is just a misunderstanding. Dad is. He's tired. He's confused about the paperwork. I'm not confused, Richard, Grandpa said. He didn't even turn to look at him. I'm the one who bought that land in 1974. I'm the one who paid the taxes on it while you were busy losing your first two companies. And I'm the one who decided that if you can't treat your own father with dignity, you don't deserve the ground he stands on. My father's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. He lunged for the microphone, but Grandpa stepped back with a grace that defied his age. Wait. My mother shrieked. The sound was high and jagged, cutting through the sophisticated atmosphere like a serrated blade. You can't do this. We have contracts. We have obligations to the Thompsons. The Thompsons, Grandpa said, looking directly at Emily's parents, are people of standing. I'm sure they wouldn't want to be in business with a man who lies about his assets and hides his family in the attic. I watched Emily. She was looking at Jason, and for the first time, I saw doubt in her eyes. The merger was falling apart before the cake had even been cut. Jason looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. He looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes, but I didn't look away. I wanted him to see. I wanted him to understand that the perfect life our parents had built for him was constructed out of stolen timber. My father finally found his voice. It was a raw, ugly sound. Get out. Get out of here right now. He was pointing at Grandpa, but he was looking at me. He knew. He knew I was the one who had brought him here. He knew I was the one who had helped him organize the trust. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the fabric of my black dress. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie rather than participating in my brother's wedding. We're leaving, Dad, I said. My voice was calm, a sharp contrast to his frantic energy. But you should probably check your email. The formal notice of the liquidation was sent 5 minutes ago. The scream finally came then. It wasn't a physical sound at first, but a realization that rippled through my mother's entire body. She looked at the guests, the elite of Portland, the people she had spent 20 years trying to impress, and she realized that they were all witnesses to her undoing. They weren't looking at her with envy anymore. They were looking at her with pity. Or worse, with disgust, and then the physical scream followed. It was a wordless, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed a crystal vase from the center of the table and hurled it toward the stage. It shattered against the stone floor, sending shards of glass. And white lilies flying in every direction, the reception descended into chaos. The string quartet stopped playing. People started standing up, grabbing their coats, their faces tight with discomfort. The wedding of the year had become a crime scene. I took Grandpa's arm. His hand was still steady. Are you ready to go? I asked. I've been ready for a long time, Sarah, he said. We walked down the center aisle, past the shattered glass and the weeping bride and the ruined father. We walked out of the tent and into the rain. The black car was waiting at the curb. As the driver pulled away, I looked back at the estate. The lights were still on, glowing through the mist, but the magic was gone. It was just an expensive tent in the mud. I'm curious. Have you ever reached a point where you realized that the only way to save yourself was to burn down the house you were raised in? Have you ever felt that terrifying, exhilarating freedom of finally telling the truth, even if it meant losing everything you were supposed to value? Leave a comment. I want to know if I'm the only one who thinks that sometimes destruction is the only path to peace. We drove in silence for a while. The city lights of Portland blurred through the rain-streaked windows. I looked at Grandpa. He was leaning back against the leather seat, his eyes closed. Are you okay? I whispered. I'm tired, he said. But for the first time in 10 years, I don't feel like I'm disappearing. I reached out and squeezed his hand. I thought about the senior support fund. I thought about the 40 acres in the gorge. I thought about the stories I was going to write. The Mitchell legacy was dead. Long live the Mitchell legacy, but there was one more thing. Something Grandpa hadn't mentioned in his speech. Something that was tucked into the very back of the folder he had given to Jason. A final piece of the puzzle that would ensure my father could never, ever recover his reputation. I looked out the window and smiled. The storm was just getting started. We arrived at my apartment. I had set up the guest room for him weeks ago. It wasn't a mansion in the West Hills, but it was warm, and it didn't have any hidden agendas. As I helped him inside, my phone started blowing up. Calls from my mother. Texts from Jason. A frantic message from my father's lawyer. I ignored them all. I turned the phone off and put it in a drawer. Tonight, there were no contracts. There were no social obligations. There was only the sound of the rain and the steady breathing of a man who had finally come home, but I knew the morning would bring a different kind of weather. I knew that by dawn, the Thompsons would have their lawyers on the phone. I knew that my father would be looking for someone to blame. And I knew that the gift in the folder was a ticking time bomb. I sat by the window and watched the city. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my grandmother, Grandpa's wife, Rose. She had died when I was 10. I remembered her telling me that the truth is like a river. You can dam it up, you can redirect it, you can pretend it isn't there, but eventually, the water always finds its way to the sea. The water had finally arrived. I thought about the Thompsons. They were smart. They would distance themselves from my father within 48 hours. They would protect their own standing. And Jason? Jason would have to decide if he wanted to be the man our father was, or the man our grandfather is. It's a hard choice to make when you've been raised on a diet of lies and expensive suits. I checked on Grandpa one last time. He was sound asleep. The charcoal suit was draped neatly over a chair. He looked peaceful. I went to my desk and opened my laptop. I started a new file. I didn't have to think about the title. It had been writing itself in my head for years. The Foundation of Lies. I began to type. Every word felt like a brick being removed from a wall. Every sentence was a breath of fresh air. I wrote about the ham radio. I wrote about the mahogany desk. I wrote about the $15,000 that had saved a business, but destroyed a family. I wrote until the sun started to peek through the gray Portland clouds. The wedding was over. The family was broken. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, utterly whole. But the folder. I keep coming back to the folder. You see, Grandpa hadn't just given Jason the deed to the land. He had given him the receipts. Not just financial receipts, but personal ones. Letters my father had written to his own father, begging for money, promising to take care of him, promising that he would never be a burden, and then there was the final document. The one that made me gasp when I first saw it in the lockbox. It was a birth certificate, but it wasn't my father's. I leaned back in my chair and watched the sky turn from gray to a pale, watery blue. The world was different now. The names had changed. The power had shifted, and the Mitchells? They were about to find out that the man they had tried to erase was the only one who knew who they really were. I'm curious. What do you think was on that birth certificate? What could be so devastating that it would ruin a man's life even more than financial bankruptcy? Tell me your theories in the comments. I'll be reading them all morning while I wait for the first knock on my door. Because I know it's coming. And this time, I'm the one who's ready. The sun was a pale, flickering light struggling to pierce through the heavy, water-bloated clouds that hung over the Willamette River. I could see the steel arches of the Fremont Bridge in the distance, a gray skeleton against a gray sky, cold and indifferent to the wreckage of the night before. The city felt different this morning. It was bone-chilling. I stood by my kitchen window, the ceramic mug in my hands offering the only warmth in the room. I watched the steam rise and dissipate, a fleeting ghost of a thing. Grandpa Henry was still asleep in the guest room. I had checked on him an hour ago, finding him tucked beneath the heavy wool blankets, his breathing rhythmic and deep. He looked smaller in sleep, less like the giant who had commanded the room at the wedding and more like a man who had finally put down a burden he had been carrying for 40 years. I looked back at the birth certificate sitting on my wooden kitchen table. It was yellowed at the edges, the paper brittle and smelling of cedar and old dust. It wasn't my father's name on the document. Or rather, it was his name, but the parents listed weren't Henry and Rose Mitchell. They were a couple from a small, dying logging town in the Cascades. My father was adopted. I felt a strange, hollow laugh bubble up in my chest, but I caught it before it reached my lips. All those years of hearing about the Mitchell bloodline. All those years of being told that we had a standard to uphold because of who we were. My father, Richard, had built his entire identity on a foundation of sand. He wasn't a Mitchell by blood, he was a Mitchell by grace. He was a boy who had been given a name and a future by the very man he had tried to exile to a dark room for being an embarrassment. I remembered a dinner when I was 19. I had brought home a boy I was seeing from university, a brilliant poet whose father worked as a janitor. My father hadn't even looked the boy in the eye. He had spent the entire meal talking about pedigree and the inherent quality of one's stock. He made a comment about how you can't breed a racehorse from a donkey. The boy never called me again. My father had smiled when I told him it was over, telling me that I would thank him one day for protecting the integrity of our family. He was a liar. He was a fraud. The buzzer for my apartment rang, a sharp, jarring sound that made me jump. I didn't have to look at the security camera to know who it was. My pulse began to throb in the hollow of my throat, a frantic, drum-like beat. I set my coffee down and walked to the intercom. "Sarah, open this door." My father's voice was unrecognizable. The polished, resonant tone he used for board meetings and wedding toasts was gone. It was replaced by a ragged, desperate rasp. He sounded like a man who had been screaming into the wind all night. "Go away, Dad," I said. My voice was calm. I was surprised by how steady I felt, even as my hands gripped the edge of the counter. "Open the door, Sarah. I know he's in there. I know you have him." I didn't answer. I walked over to the door and peered through the peephole. He was standing in the hallway, his suit jacket gone, his white shirt wrinkled and stained with what looked like wine. His hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was a wild mess. He looked old. He looked broken. I opened the door just a crack, leaving the security chain in place. He lunged forward, his weight hitting the wood with a dull thud. "The liquidation, Sarah," he hissed. He pressed his face toward the gap. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The bank called me an hour ago. They're pulling the line of credit for the waterfront project. Without your grandfather's assets as collateral, the whole thing is gone. 10 years of work. Gone. It wasn't your work," I said. "It was his. You just used it." He let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You think you're so righteous. You think you're the hero of this story. You're just a spoiled brat who doesn't understand how the world works. You need money to survive, Sarah. You need status. No, I said. You need those things. I just need to be able to look at myself in the mirror." I saw his eyes drop to the table behind me. He saw the folder. He saw the yellowed paper. His face went from a dark, angry red to a ghostly, translucent white. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it might crush the air out of the hallway. "You found it," he whispered. "I did," I said. "Grandpa gave it to Jason. I assume Jason has seen it by now." My father's knees actually seemed to give way. He slumped against the doorframe, his head dropping to his chest. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. "He told me he'd never tell," my father said. His voice was a tiny, fragile thing now. "He promised me when I was 21. He said the past didn't matter. He said I was his son." He was right, I said. The past didn't matter. But the way you treated him did. You were his son, Richard. And you treated him like a piece of garbage because you were afraid someone would find out you didn't belong. You were so busy trying to be a Mitchell that you forgot how to be a human being. I'm curious. Have you ever known someone who was so afraid of their own history that they tried to destroy everyone who remembered it? Have you ever seen a man crumble not because of a financial loss, but because the truth finally caught up to him? I watched him for a long time. I felt a flicker of pity, a brief, unwanted spark of empathy for the boy he must have been. The boy who felt he had to earn his place in the world through perfection. But then I thought about the ham radio. I thought about the mahogany desk. I thought about the way he had spoken to Grandpa in the living room 3 weeks ago. The pity died. You should leave, I said. Grandpa is resting. He doesn't want to see you. He didn't move. He just stayed there, slumped against the door, a man who had lost his company, his reputation, and his father all in the span of 12 hours. The Thompson lawyers called this morning, he said, his voice muffled by the wood. They're advising Jason to seek an annulment. They say the marriage was built on fraudulent pretenses. I felt a pang of sadness for my brother, but I knew the Thompsons were just doing what people of standing do. They were protecting their brand. My father had tried to merge with them, and instead, he had given them a reason to erase him. I'm sorry for Jason, I said. But maybe this is the best thing that could happen to him. Maybe now he has a chance to be something other than your shadow. I closed the door. I didn't wait for him to respond. I heard his footsteps as he walked away, a slow, dragging sound that echoed down the hallway. I went back to the kitchen and sat down. Grandpa Henry came out of the guest room a few minutes later. He was wearing the robe I had bought him, his hair silver and neat. He looked at me, then at the door, then at the folder on the table. He was here, wasn't he? Grandpa asked. Yes, I said. Grandpa sat down across from me. He reached out and touched the birth certificate. I never wanted him to feel like he didn't belong, Sarah. Your grandmother and I, we loved him from the second they put him in our arms. We gave him everything. I know you did, Grandpa. He sighed, a long, weary sound. But some people, they can't handle a gift like that. They think if they didn't earn it with their own blood, it isn't real. He spent his whole life trying to prove he was better than us. He thought he could outrun his own heart. I looked at Grandpa. He didn't look angry. He just looked sad. He looked like a man who had watched a long, slow-motion disaster and finally reached the end of the wreckage. What now? I asked. Now we build something real, he said. He looked out the window at the Portland skyline. I've been looking at a place. A community. It's called Elmwood. I asked. That a retirement home? I asked, my heart sinking slightly. No, he said with a smile. It's a garden. They have small cottages, a workshop, and about 10 acres of land that needs tending. I think I'd like to spend my time there. And I want the foundation to be based there, too. I looked at the documents for the Senior Support Fund. I saw the names of the board members he had already drafted. My name was at the top. You're sure? I asked. I've never been sure of anything else, Sarah. I want to be around people who see me. Not people who are trying to use me as a background for their own vanity. We spent the rest of the morning talking about the future. It was a strange, quiet transition. The chaos of the wedding and the violence of my father's downfall felt like a dream. In my apartment, there was just coffee and rain and the slow, steady planning of a new life. I thought about the word legacy. My father had used it like a weapon. He had used it to exclude and to demean. But as I looked at Grandpa Henry, I realized that a legacy isn't something you leave behind when you die. It's something you give away while you're alive. It's the way you handle the truth when it's uncomfortable. It's the way you protect the people who can't protect themselves. I'm curious. If you found out your entire life was based on a secret like that, would you have the courage to face it? Or would you keep running, like my father did? I went on my laptop and opened the file I had started earlier. The Foundation of Lies. I deleted the title. I typed a new one. The Inheritance of Grace. I started to write. I wrote about the way the light hit the charcoal suit. I wrote about the sound of the rain on the wedding tent. I wrote about the man who wasn't a Mitchell by blood, but who was the only one who truly understood what the name meant. The water had found its way to the sea. The river was calm. And for the first time in 29 years, I wasn't just observing a story. I was living one. But as the afternoon faded into a deep, Portland purple, I realized that there was still one loose end. My mother. She hadn't called. She hadn't shown up. And knowing Patricia, that was far more dangerous than my father's desperate screaming. I looked at Grandpa. He was watching the birds at the feeder on my balcony. He looked at peace, but I knew the storm wasn't over. Not yet. I reached for my phone. It was time to make one more call. Not to a lawyer. Not to a reporter. I called Jason. It was time for my brother to hear the truth from someone who didn't want anything from him. It was time to see if the Mitchell blood, or lack of it, actually meant anything at all. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. Sarah? His voice was thin, haunted. Hey, Jason, I said. I need you to come over. There's something you need to see. I looked at the yellowed birth certificate. I looked at the man by the window. The play was over. The real world was waiting. And I was finally ready to step onto the stage. Jason arrived 40 minutes after I hung up the phone. The rain had slowed to a miserable, biting mist that clung to the windows like a shroud. When I opened the door, my brother looked like a man who had been pulled from a shipwreck. He was still wearing his wedding trousers and a wrinkled white dress shirt, his silk tie hanging limp around his neck like a noose. He smelled of expensive cologne and damp wool. He didn't say hello. He just walked past me into the kitchen, his movements heavy and mechanical. He saw Grandpa sitting at the table, and for a second, I thought Jason might break right there on the linoleum. He gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles white, his chest heaving as he fought for breath. Emily is at her parents' house, Jason said. His voice was a flat, dead thing. Her father has already contacted a specialist in annulments. They're calling it misrepresentation of character. They're saying the entire foundation of the marriage contract was fraudulent because Dad lied about the business assets. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Sarah, is it true? Is the company actually going under? It was never what he said it was, Jason, I told him. I walked over to the table and slid the yellowed birth certificate toward him. I watched his eyes track the lines of text. I watched the moment the Mitchell legacy died in his mind. He didn't scream. He didn't even gasp. He just sat down, the air leaving his lungs in one long, shaky exhale. He looked like a child. Small and lost. I remembered the summer Jason turned 10. Our father had decided Jason was old enough to start learning the family business. He made Jason spend every Saturday in the office, filing papers and sitting through meetings he didn't understand. One afternoon, Jason had accidentally deleted a series of spreadsheets. It was a simple mistake, something that could have been fixed in an hour. But our father had sat him down and told him that his failure had cost the family a seat at the table of the elite. He told Jason that he was a disappointment to 5 generations of Mitchells. Jason cried for 3 days, believing he had broken a chain that went back a century. I watched Jason now, and that memory felt like a hot iron in my chest. The injustice of it was staggering. Our father had spent decades making a little boy feel guilty for not living up to a history that didn't even belong to him. He had used a ghost story to haunt his own son. You're not a disappointment, Jason, Grandpa Henry said. He reached across the table and placed his hand over Jason's. You are a good man who was raised by a man who was terrified of the truth, but what am I now? Jason asked. He looked at the birth certificate. If I'm not a Mitchell, who am I? You're Jason, I said. And for the first time in your life, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a legacy. You can just be you. Jason looked at the paper for a long time. Then, slowly, he began to tear it. Not in anger, but with a deliberate, surgical precision. He tore the lie into tiny, white flakes until they piled up on the table like snow. The phone on the counter began to vibrate. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I didn't pick it up. A few seconds later, Jason's phone started ringing in his pocket. He took it out, looked at the screen, and set it face down on the table. She called me 20 times while I was driving here, Jason whispered. She kept talking about the Thompsons. She kept saying we have to find a way to fix the image. She hasn't even asked how I'm doing. She just wants to know if I can convince Emily to stay for the sake of the social season. I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. My mother, Patricia, was the architect of the image. My father provided the lies, but she was the one who polished them until they shone. She was the one who had decided Grandpa was an embarrassment. She was the one who had turned our home into a gallery of performance art. I'm curious. Have you ever realized that the person who is supposed to protect you is actually the one who is most invested in your destruction? Have you ever had to walk away from a mother who only saw you as a trophy? The silence in the kitchen was broken by a sudden, sharp pounding on my apartment door. It wasn't my father this time. The rhythm was different. It was frantic, high-pitched, and unrelenting. "Sarah, open this door right now." It was my mother. Her voice was a jagged glass shards against the wood. I looked at Jason. I looked at Grandpa. They both looked back at me with a shared sense of exhaustion. The play was trying to force its way into the room, but we were no longer the audience. I walked to the door and opened it. My mother stood in the hallway, her silk wedding suit stained at the hem, her makeup running in dark streaks down her face. She looked like a tragedy queen who had lost her stage. "Where is your father?" she demanded, pushing past me into the room. She saw Jason and Grandpa at the table and stopped. "Jason, what are you doing? You should be with Emily. You should be apologizing to Edward. We can still save this if we act quickly." "Save what, Mom?" Jason asked. He didn't stand up. He didn't even look at her. "The company is bankrupt. The marriage is over. And the Mitchell family doesn't exist. Don't you dare say that," she shrieked. She turned her fury on Grandpa. "This is your fault. You and your spiteful little speeches. You've ruined everything we worked for." "Henry didn't ruin anything, Patricia," Grandpa said calmly. He stood up, using his cane for support. He looked at her with a profound, quiet pity. "You and Richard built a house out of paper, and then you acted surprised when it rained. I didn't destroy your legacy. I just turned on the lights." My mother's face twisted into something unrecognizable. She looked at me, her eyes narrow and venomous. "And you? You were always the jealous one. You couldn't handle that your brother was the star. You had to drag us all down to your level." "I'm not at your level, Mom," I said. "I'm standing on the ground. You're the one who's falling." She lunged toward the table, her hand swinging back to slap me, but Jason caught her wrist. He didn't use force, just a steady, immovable grip. "That's enough, Mom," Jason said. "It's over." The air seemed to leave the room. My mother looked at her son, the boy she had molded into a perfect instrument of social climbing, and she saw a stranger. She saw the man she couldn't control. She pulled her arm away, her chest heaving, her eyes darting around the apartment as if she were looking for an exit from a life she no longer recognized. "You're all monsters," she whispered. "You have no idea what it took to build this life. You have no idea the sacrifices I made." "We know exactly what you sacrificed," I said. "You sacrificed the truth. And you sacrificed your family." She turned and stumbled out of the apartment, her heels clicking a frantic, uneven rhythm on the hallway floor. I closed the door and locked it. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood and closed my eyes. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Jason. "What do we do now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we get Grandpa to Elmwood. And then, we start telling the real story." I thought about the inheritance of grace. I thought about the words that were waiting for me on my laptop. I thought about the people who had been sidelined, the people who had been told they were an embarrassment. The Mitchell legacy was dead. But the Mitchell truth was just beginning to breathe. I'm curious. If you were Jason, would you have forgiven me for being the one to tear it all down? Or would you have hated me for showing you the wreckage? I looked at my brother. He didn't look like he hated me. He looked like he was seeing the world clearly for the very first time. And in that clarity, I saw the possibility of a different kind of family. One that wasn't based on blood or names or social standing. One that was based on the courage to stay in the room when the lights come on. We spent the rest of the night in the kitchen. We didn't talk about the company or the Thompsons. We talked about the ham radio. We talked about the garden in the gorge. We talked about Grandma Rose. The storm was still raging outside, but inside, the air was still. The water had found the sea. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just writing the ending. I was living the beginning, but as I looked at the pile of torn paper on the table, I knew that my father wouldn't go quietly. A man who has lost everything has nothing left to fear. And Richard Mitchell was a man who had spent his whole life fearing the light. I checked the window. The black car was gone, but the city was still there. Waiting for the morning. Waiting for the truth to hit the headlines. I was ready. I was finally ready. We moved Grandpa Henry into Elmwood 3 days after the wedding. The transition was quieter than I expected, a soft fading of one life into the next. There were no movers in white jumpsuits, no heavy furniture to navigate through narrow Portland corridors, and certainly no frantic instructions from my mother. It only took 3 boxes. 3 cardboard boxes for 78 years of a life that my father had tried to convince the world was empty. As I taped the last one shut, I realized that the things Grandpa truly valued, his old engineering manuals, a few framed photos of my grandmother Rose, and his collection of hand tools, didn't weigh much at all. The weight had always been the expectations of the people who didn't really know him. The house in the West Hills was silent when we left. My father was locked in his study, likely surrounded by lawyers and crumbling balance sheets. My mother had retreated to a friend's beach house in Gerhardt, unable to face the neighbors. The silence was absolute. It was terrifying. I carried the boxes to my car, the damp air smelling of wet pavement and the end of something. I didn't look back at the stone facade or the manicured lawn. I just looked at Grandpa, who was sitting in the passenger seat of my old hatchback, watching the windshield wipers clear the mist. He looked lighter than I had ever seen him. I remembered a rainy Tuesday 5 years ago when I had dropped by the house unannounced. I found Grandpa sitting on a plastic stool in the garage because my mother had guests over for a bridge club luncheon. She told him he couldn't sit in the living room because his presence made the house feel like an assisted living facility. He was eating a sandwich off a paper towel. He looked so small amidst the luxury SUVs and the expensive mountain bikes. I had walked in and felt a surge of rage so sharp I thought I might be physically ill, but Grandpa just smiled and offered me half his ham and cheese. He had been a prisoner in his own home for years, and we were finally walking through the gates. The drive to Elmwood was long. We skirted the edge of the city, watching the skyline of Portland grow smaller in the rearview mirror. I kept thinking about the news reports. The local business journals were already tearing into Mitchell developments. Fraud. Misrepresentation. The loss of the Thompson merger. My father's name was being dragged through the mud he had spent his life trying to polish. I felt a cold sense of justice, but it wasn't the fiery, explosive kind I had imagined. It was a slow, clinical satisfaction. Like watching a fever finally break, Elmwood was exactly what Grandpa needed. It wasn't a clinical facility with beige walls and the smell of bleach. It was a collection of small, cedar-shingled cottages tucked into a valley where the air always smelled like pine needles and damp earth. There was a community garden that stretched toward the foothills and a shared workshop where the sound of saws and sandpaper hummed like a heartbeat. When we pulled up, a man about Grandpa's age was sitting on a porch, carving something out of a piece of driftwood. He looked up and waved. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a coronation. "This is it," I said. Grandpa climbed out of the car, his mahogany cane clicking against the gravel path. He took a long, deep breath of the mountain air. "It's perfect, Sarah," he whispered. "It's quiet." I spent the afternoon helping him settle into his cottage. We put the engineering manuals on the built-in shelves. We hung the photo of Grandma Rose over the small fireplace. We set his hand tools on the workbench in the corner. For the first time in a decade, he wasn't a guest in someone else's life. He was the master of his own. I watched him run his hand over the smooth wood of the desk, and I realized that my father had tried to buy prestige while Grandpa had always owned character. You can't mortgage character. You can't trade it for a seat at a lawyer's table. As the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the valley, I sat on the small porch with him. We shared a thermos of tea I had brought. The piece was so thick you could almost touch it. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a news alert about the formal bankruptcy filing of Mitchell Developments, but I didn't open it. The noise of that world felt like it belonged to a different century. I'm curious. Have you ever walked away from a situation that everyone told you was successful, only to realize that the success was actually a cage? Have you ever felt the relief of losing everything that didn't actually matter? Let me know in the comments. I think we all have a West Hills we need to leave behind. The Senior Support Fund launched 2 weeks later. I used the money from the liquidation of Grandpa's assets to hire a small, dedicated staff. We set up our office in an old converted warehouse in the Pearl District, a place with high ceilings and brick walls that didn't pretend to be anything they weren't. We called it the Henry Mitchell Foundation. I liked the way the name sounded. It didn't sound like a brand. It sounded like a promise. The work was grueling at first. We were inundated with stories of seniors who had been sidelined, ignored, or financially exploited by their own families. It turned out my father wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a much larger disease. I spent my days listening to these stories, recording them, and then using the Foundation's resources to provide legal aid, housing assistance, and social connection. We were building a safety net for the people the world had decided to forget. Jason came by the office about a month into the project. He looked better. He had traded the expensive suits for jeans and a flannel shirt. He was working at a local marketing firm, a small outfit that specialized in nonprofits. He didn't have a corner office or a title that impressed the Thompsons, but he had a look in his eyes that I recognized. He was finally awake. How's he? Jason asked, leaning against the doorframe of my office. He's thriving, I said. He's teaching a woodworking class at Elmwood. I think he's already fixed half the furniture in the valley. Jason smiled. He deserved better than what we gave him. Sarah. He's getting it now, I said. We talked for a long time about the future. Jason was helping us with the Foundation's outreach, using his marketing skills to tell the stories of the seniors we were helping. It was a different kind of legacy than the one our father had envisioned. It wasn't about building towers of glass and steel. It was about rebuilding the bridges between generations. The Foundation grew faster than I ever expected. Within the first 6 months, we had helped over 50 people. By the end of the first year, it was 200. We were funding art classes, music programs, and garden projects across the state. Every time I shared a success story with Grandpa, he would just nod and smile, his hands often stained with sawdust or soil. You're doing good work, Sarah. He'd say. I thought about my father during those months. I heard through the grapevine that he was working as a consultant for a small firm in another city, trying to claw his way back. My mother was still at the coast, largely ignored by the social circles she had once commanded. They were still alive, but they were ghosts. They were haunting a world that had moved on without them. The injustice of their behavior used to keep me up at night, but now it just felt like a distant, faded memory. I remembered a time when I was 5 and I had spilled juice on the white silk sofa in the formal living room. My mother had looked at me with such genuine horror, as if I had committed a crime against humanity. She spent 3 days trying to scrub the stain out, her face tight with a cold, simmering resentment. She cared more about the silk than the child who had spilled the juice. That was the Mitchell way. Everything was for show. Everything was fragile, but at Elmwood, nothing was fragile. The wood was solid. The soil was deep. The people were real. I spent a Saturday with Grandpa in the community garden. We were planting spring bulbs, tulips, and daffodils that wouldn't bloom for months. The ground was cold and wet, and my fingernails were black with dirt. I looked at Grandpa, who was kneeling in the soil, his face focused and calm. These won't be ready until April, he said, patting the earth over a bulb. I know, I said. It's good to plant things that take time, he whispered. It means you're planning on being there to see them. That was the moment I knew we had won. The revenge hadn't been about the bankruptcy or the ruined wedding. The revenge was the fact that we were still standing, and we were happy. We had taken the embarrassment and turned it into the cornerstone of something beautiful. I'm curious, do you think true success is measured by what you build for yourself or what you build for others? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what a real legacy looks like. The shadows in the garden grew long as we finished the row. I helped Grandpa up, his knees cracking in the quiet air. We walked back toward his cottage, the lights of the other homes beginning to flicker on in the dusk. It felt like a village. It felt like a home. The Mitchell name was still on my driver's license, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a responsibility. A responsibility to ensure that no one else ever felt the way Grandpa had felt in that armchair. I looked at the mountain peaks, white with the first dusting of winter snow. The storm was over. The air was clear. And as I walked beside the man who had taught me everything I needed to know about strength, I realized that the best part of the story wasn't the ending. It was the fact that we were finally, for the first time in our lives, living the truth. I pulled my jacket tighter against the evening chill. Tomorrow, I had a meeting with a new donor. Tomorrow, there were more stories to tell. But tonight, there was just the smell of pine and the sound of my grandfather's steady, rhythmic breathing. He was home. And so was I. I sat in my office in the Pearl District long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement outside like scattered diamonds. The sign on the door was simple: the Henry Mitchell Foundation. It was a modest plaque, brushed steel against dark wood, but every time I walked past it, I felt a tremor of pride in the center of my chest. It was a physical sensation, a warmth that started in my heart and radiated outward to my fingertips. My parents had spent their lives trying to etch their names into the skyline of Portland with glass and steel, but they never realized that those materials are cold. They don't hold heat. They don't remember the people who touched them. My foundation was built on something much more durable. It was built on the stories of people who had been pushed into the shadows. I spent my afternoons reading through case files, each one a mirror of what had almost happened to Grandpa Henry. There was a woman from Lake Oswego whose children had sold her house while she was in the hospital. There was a retired teacher in Beaverton whose daughter had drained her savings to buy a luxury SUV. The stories were different, but the injustice was always the same. It was the belief that once a person stops producing, they stop being a person. I remember a gala my parents hosted when I was 22. They had invited everyone who was anyone in the real estate world. I was standing near the buffet, trying to blend into the wallpaper, when I heard my mother talking to a potential investor. She pointed at me and said, "Sarah is our little observer. She's a writer, you know. It's a lovely little hobby for her while she waits to find a husband who actually does something." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound that made me feel like I was made of glass. I was invisible. I was just a prop in her play. She didn't know I was writing it all down. I checked my watch. It was late, but I wanted to finish one last letter. We had just secured a grant to expand our legal advocacy program into Southern Oregon. As I typed, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't known for most of my adult life. The frantic, buzzing anxiety that used to live under my skin, the feeling that I was always one mistake away from being cast out, had finally vanished. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was the one giving it. I looked at a photo on my desk. It was taken a few weeks ago at Elmwood. Grandpa was sitting on a bench with a group of other seniors, his face animated as he explained the physics of a cantilever bridge. He looked younger than he had at the wedding. He looked vital. He looked like a man who had finally found his tribe. The Mitchell legacy was never about the buildings. It was about the endurance. My father thought he was the architect, but he was just the demolition crew. He had tried to tear down the very thing that supported him. Now he was living in a rental apartment in a city where no one knew his name, working for a man 10 years his junior. My mother was still at the beach, writing letters to people who had long ago deleted her number. They were still alive, but the world they had inhabited had been proven to be a hallucination. I think about the word family a lot these days. We're taught that it's a biological imperative, a bond that cannot be broken. But I've learned that family is a choice. It's a verb. It's the act of showing up when it's inconvenient. It's the decision to protect someone even when it costs your social standing. Real family isn't about blood. I stood up and put on my coat. The office was quiet, the only sound the hum of the city outside. I thought about the Thompsons. I heard Emily had eventually married a partner at her father's firm. It was a sensible match, I'm sure. A merger of two legacies that probably looked perfect in the society pages. I wondered if she ever thought about the man in the charcoal suit. I wondered if she ever felt the hollow space where the truth was supposed to be. Jason and I are closer now than we've ever been. We don't talk about the Mitchell standards anymore. We talk about our lives. We talk about our work. We talk about the garden. He's dating a woman who works as a nurse, someone who doesn't care about his last name or his father's bankrupt company. She likes him because he's kind. She likes him because he listens. It's a simple life. It's a real life. I drove out to Elmwood the next morning. The winter had finally broken, and the air was crisp and clear, the smell of damp pine needles filling the valley. I found Grandpa in the community garden. He was kneeling in the dirt, his hands covered in dark soil. He was planting spring bulbs, hundreds of them. You're busy today, I said, leaning against the fence. Grandpa looked up and smiled. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of earth across his brow. These won't bloom for months, Sarah. Maybe not until late April. I know, I said. He looked at the rows of buried bulbs. I'm planting them anyway because I have months ahead of me. I have time. And for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of that time. I'm excited about it. I watched him work. He was 78 years old, and he was planning for a future he wasn't sure he'd see, but he was doing it with a joy that was infectious. He wasn't a liability. He wasn't an embarrassment. He was a gardener. He was a builder. That was when I knew we had made the right choice. He hadn't given up on life by moving here. He had reclaimed it. He had stepped out of the dark room and into the sun. I have to ask you, now that you've heard the whole story, what would you have done? If you were standing on those stairs and heard your parents erasing your grandfather, would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have had the courage to confront the people who raised you? It's a hard question. It's a question that changes everything. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I want to know where you stand on family loyalty versus the truth. If you've enjoyed following this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about the things that truly matter. Remember, real family isn't just about sharing blood. It's about spending time and sharing every important moment together. Sometimes, the family you're born into isn't the one that's meant for you. Sometimes, family is the one you choose. It's the one that chooses to truly see you, even when you're standing in the back of the room. I walked over and knelt in the dirt next to my grandfather. I picked up a bulb. It was small and brown and looked like nothing special. But I knew what was inside. I knew the potential that was waiting for the right season. I dug a hole and placed it in the earth. I covered it with soil and patted it down. We stayed there for a long time, the two of us, working in silence. The sun was warm on our backs. The mountains were white with snow. The air was full of the future. The Mitchell legacy was dead. The truth was finally home.